One of the most interesting aspects of shadow work for me is exploring what's called the ancestral shadow. And a big part of the ancestral shadow is based on a phenomena called epigenetic trauma. In 2013, there was a landmark study that was published in the esteemed journal Nature, which looked at how trauma was being passed down in several generations of mice families. The experiment went like this. They basically electrocuted these mice, and as they electrocuted them, they exposed them to the smell of cherry blossom, a specific smell, a specific scent, right? Eventually, after doing this several times, they could then expose the mice to the smell of cherry blossom, and the mice would freak out, obviously, because they associated the smell with the trauma of being electrocuted. So far, so Pavlovian, right? Pavlovian reflex. However, when these traumatized mice bred and had babies, those babies were removed from the parents as soon as they were born, so there could be no transference of the habit of trauma. And when those baby mice were exposed to cherry blossom, they also freaked out, even though they had had no traumatic association with being electrocuted and cherry blossom. When those baby mice grew up and bred, those mice, so this is now the grandchildren of the original traumatized mice, when the grandchildren mice were exposed to the smell of cherry blossom, they also freaked out. The trauma of the original electrocution had been passed down the line 3 generations. When they dissected the brains of the grandchildren of the traumatized mice, they found that the brains of those mice actually contained more neurons to do with picking up the scent of something similar to cherry blossom, meaning that the grandchildren of the originally traumatized mice were neurologically predisposed to react fearfully when exposed to the scent linked to the original trauma. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. Now, you might have heard of that study, even though it is this amazing study to hear about if you haven't. What you may not have heard of is the follow-up study, because it didn't get nearly as much press. The same team did a follow-up study where they worked with the children and the grandchildren of the originally traumatized mice, and they saw, could we reverse this trauma? So what they did is a form of exposure therapy, a form of shadow work. They basically started putting in a little bit of the cherry blossom scent, but this time not electrocuting the mice, but stroking them and giving them food and letting them play and have sex and all kind of fun mice things. So eventually they were desensitized to the smell of cherry blossom and no longer freaked out when they smelt it. That's really important to know, because it shows that even though the trauma experienced by our grandparents can be passed down several generations, we're not stuck with it. There are things we can do. We can integrate the ancestral shadow so we don't have to pass it down. Because those mice who had the exposure therapy, so then they no longer feared the scent of cherry blossom, when they had kids, their kids were free of any trauma response.